Where the Bright Waters Meet by Harry Plunkett Green. Chapter 3, Wildlife in the Bourne Valley, 1903. The broad water of the Bourne begins at the iron bridge which carries the road to St Mary Bourne. The water here rushes strongly through the arches, and there has always been a back eddy near the arch, and that back eddy in those days always held a good fish. He lay at right angles to the stream in the shallow water and watched the traffic on the road above out of the back of his head. It was possible to see him by crawling up to the bridge and putting one's eye round the corner like a fox terrier waiting for the postman. It was also an easy cast from the road, but after trying the game once or twice, to his intense amusement, I blushingly gave it up. I either had to get him from below or not at all. But here I was faced by the fact that, try as I would, I was invariably defeated by the drag. If I threw directly in front of him, the back eddy swished the fly across his nose and drowned it. And if I threw in a bunch and trusted to luck, the main stream whipped it out, and in either case he was off for the next half hour. It was maddening to be beaten each time and to see a good fish flaunting himself in the open and treating me with contempt. It infuriated me, and I kept pegging away at him day after day, and then all of a sudden, one afternoon, I saw my fly float, beautifully cocked, right up the channel over his nose, and he took it at once. This particular fish was a long, ugly beast, as I knew, with a huge head and teeth like a dog, and better out of the water than in it. But that was not the point. The thing was that it was possible after all to do the apparently impossible and float a fly into that impenetrable dugout. And the laugh at last was on the other side. I remembered that on this particular occasion my fly had been caught up on a patch of lichen growing on the bridge, and had taken an appreciable time to fall off. I had tried dozens of times the expedient of hitting the bridge first, but it had never come off until now. I knew that there would be soon another, and probably better, tenant of this lie, so I went back and experimented for half an hour, and found that nearly every time I hit the particular bit of lichen the fly behaved like a lady and sailed up the back eddy in a dignified manner. It was a great discovery and got me several fine fish that season, until they too found out about it and deserted the spot, for fish have some occult power of warning one another or extracting wisdom from the fate of their neighbours. I'll deal further with this later on. The secret of this particular cast, probably, was that the momentary hesitation of the fly, when it was caught up in the lichen, gave the cast time to belly round the swirl and pull the point gently back up the slack water. I did not always have it my own way here, however, for the very next day I lost a new tenant and two others in the same pool, one owing to my reel jamming, another because the butt got caught in my watch chain, and the third because it leapt out of the water with a parabola like a rainbow and dazed me into practical insensibility. I had an exciting time one day in July with a 2.5 pounder at the junction of the Bourne and the Test. They meet at right angles at the bottom of the Heronry Garden and rush at great speed through the hatch into a deep drop on the other side. I got into him in the Bourne about 30 yards above the hatch, and he ran upstream with perfect good taste. But then he suddenly darted back, raced past me to the hatch, and was sucked through in a moment, and thrown out into the stream about 10 yards below, where he lay, still on the hook, swinging backwards and forwards in the current. It was impossible to pass the rod through the hatch, and equally impossible to stick the spike into the ground, for this particular spot was either hard stones or soft mud. So I had to wade across and lash the rod firmly to a pollard. I then went down below the hatch and netted him here. It was not exactly orthodox, but any port in a storm He was too bewildered by his experiences to give me any trouble, but it was less easy than it sounds, for the cows were in the water and he was washing about against their knees, and I had more trouble in shepherding him than landing him. I had a far more complicated and exciting experience of the same sort once on the Kennet, which I hope to tell later. It was on this day, and just above this spot, that I saw a stoat kill a wild duck, and I can remember now the blind fury with which I dashed across the river and tried to murder him, the pot calling the kettle black. It is one of the most interesting things about fishing, that one is admitted almost automatically to the intimate side of the wildlife. Moments such as I have described, when the bloodlust makes wild things blind, are not the whole of it. Above and beyond, there seems to be a subtle recognition of the fact that the fisherman is bent on other matters, and that he may be looked upon either as a friend, which he certainly is, or as unconcerned, and therefore not to be shunned. It is commonplace that if you walk through a field of cows or horses with a rod over your shoulder, they will go on feeding unconcernedly, whereas if you had an ordinary stick in your hand, they would make haste to get out of your way, and the same thing seems to apply to the swallows and the swifts and bird life generally. General Cooper tells me that shortly after the completion of the Uganda Railway in 1903, steps were taken to prevent the indiscriminate slaughter of the huge herds of antelope and big game in the country through which the railway passed. As a matter of convenience, the track itself was taken as a boundary, and one side of the line was made out of bounds for shooting. For about 150 miles of this track, the line ran through open grazing country, carrying innumerable herds of antelope, hartebeest, Grant's gazelles, wildebeest, giraffe, ostrich, etc. For a while, after the institution of the reserve, the game would scatter in all directions on the approach of a train. After some time, however, they would barely interrupt their grazing, and would merely look curiously at the strange beast that apparently never hurt them. After a further lapse of time, the north side of the track became almost deserted, whilst on the south side, the reserve, they continued to play about and feed up close to the line in hardly diminished numbers. The line itself is a single unfenced track, but the game had learned that on one side was safety, and on the other, peril. The topography and the grazing were identical on each side. Mr. Sheringham says that he often sees the herons doing the same thing by the Fairford line. He once counted 13 in one field. The stoat is a puzzling creature. At one time he will run from you for his life, and at another he will take no notice of you whatever. I remember one which came out of the long grass by the bourne and walked deliberately right across both my feet and into the grass beyond. He was certainly not on the kill, but he must have been thinking of something important. It was about the only time in my life that one of his sort did not inspire me with the wish to kill him for killing the things I love. He was so gentle and confiding that I let him go in peace. I remember, too, standing beside a footbridge below the church at Hurstbourne and seeing a stoat emerge out of the flags at my feet with a dead water rat in its mouth and carry it to the plank in front of me. It was as big as he was, and he pushed it across the bridge in front of him, stopping every couple of feet to rest. But I had one experience with a stoat which I shall never forget. I had been fishing close to Savage's cottage and was coming down through the meadow to get to the lower water when a hare came loping across the field and sat down quite close to me and gazed up at me pathetically. I had not a notion what it all meant, for a hare does not generally seek man's company or move so deliberately into danger, and I came to the conclusion that it must be blind. And then I became aware of a small object moving towards us from the far side of the meadow. and I realised that I was actually witnessing a thing of which I had often heard and which I had never seen before: a stoat running a hare down. I had heard that if it once starts, it will follow a hare all day across country until it wears it down. It came across to within 15 yards of me and sat up. The hare was sitting up almost at my feet, and there we stayed and looked at one another. Then I picked up a stone, the only weapon I could find, and threw it at the stoat, and I have never regretted so much that my hand had lost the cunning of my boyhood in Ireland, where stone throwing is a fine art. I missed it, of course, and it made off in one direction and the hare in another. It must have got the poor thing in the end, but I can still see that hare's appealing eyes and feel the shamefaced glow of pride that when it was in deadly peril, it came to me for help. The hare was not alone in that respect. In the summer of 1911, the year of the great heat, we practically lived in the hall of the Longhouse as it was the only cool spot in the place. We were at luncheon there early one day when a swallow dashed in through the open door and swooped round our heads, calling at the top of his voice. We thought at first that he'd come in by mistake and was frightened by his audience. But when he flew out and in again several times, calling to us all the while, we guessed that something was wrong and that he was asking us to come out and help. I jumped up and ran outside. He flew backwards and forwards through the porch, telling me to look up. There was a strong Jackmania creeper over the porch, kept in its place inside by a net, and in one of the meshes his mate was hanging by her neck. I had my knife out in a moment and cut her down. She seemed past help, poor little soul, but I laid her on the path and dropped water on her head, the only thing I could think of at the moment, while he flew round and round beseeching her by name. For a long time she lay there without a movement, and then she stirred a little, and then she lifted her head, and suddenly up she shot, and off they went together, calling to high heaven for joy. In this context I am going to anticipate. On my return from Germany, to which I refer in the next chapter, my parents took an old house in Sussex for the spring and the summer. There was a wonderful old barn in the farmyard, beautiful to look at, but built on the cockeyed principle of putting a roof of huge stone slabs onto walls of wooden planks. I was walking through the farmyard one morning and had just passed through the barn and was climbing the bank up to the meadow on the other side when there was a roaring crash behind me, and there was the barn in ruins. Vast clouds of dust were rising into the air, and I was standing there thanking my stars that it had deferred its end till I was out of the way, when I felt something give me a gentle shove in the middle of my back. I turned round, and there behind me were a dozen cows with 2 horses in front of them, one of which had been chosen by the unwritten law as their ambassador to ask me what the something or other I had been and gone and done to their barn. The degrees of mental superiority slightly acknowledged and obeyed in domestic animals are almost instructive. If you throw an armful of cut grass over the fence into a cow field, the cows will eat it tranquilly. But let a horse come along, and the cows will make him a humble obeisance and retire from the scene. We are so accustomed to such animal snobbery that we take it for granted, but it was once vividly illustrated for my benefit. I was fishing a few summers ago on Loch Mask in Ireland, and one day in the early hours of the morning I was awoken by a terrific noise outside my window. I leapt from my bed and looked out, and there below me was a stampede of cows, horses, donkeys, goats, turkeys, ducks and hens galloping for their lives, with a diminutive Yorkshire cum black and tan terrier yapping at their heels. The bonefish, though a highly trained opponent to the old hand, was sometimes very kind to beginners. A nephew of mine at Eton, now familiar to readers of the field as Mugdrum, came over for his long leave to Hurstbourne and got 4 very good fish and lost 2 others. He had never thrown a dry fly in his life and was promptly inoculated with the disease and has been a mad dry fly man ever since. The same applied to another Eton boy, Merrick Bovell, with whom I have often fished since. He learned his first dry fly lesson that year on the Bourne and blooded himself with a 2.5 pounder in almost the exact place below the viaduct where I had got the 3 I spoke of before. He went to Norway that summer, where he promptly proceeded to kill 40 salmon in a fortnight. On the same day, I got 6 fish weighing 9.5 pounds, a very fair sample of what the Bourne was prepared to do for her friends. In 1903, I fished 51 days and got 165 fish weighing 233.25 pounds. This works out at just under 1.5 pounds of fish, but in view of the rules I followed with regard to weighing, of which I spoke earlier, the average was really over, not under this weight. I had no blank day, and I finished up with the biggest and the best fish I ever caught in either the Bourne or the Test.